The silence in the grand ballroom was so profound, you could hear the crystal chandeliers chiming. Brett Harrington had just spent 10 minutes loudly dismantling Sophia's dignity, calling her a penniless nobody in front of London's most elite circles. But as the towering commander of the Royal Guard stepped through the brass-studded doors, he didn't look at Brett. He didn't look at the billionaires or the lords. He locked eyes with Sophia, snapped his heels together with a crack that echoed off the marble, and threw a flawless salute. "Ma'am," he barked, and in that one single word, the Harrington family realized they had just humiliated the most dangerous woman in the room. They say, love is blind, but perhaps it just plays tricks with memory. When Sophia first met Arthur Harrington, they were caught in a sudden downpour in a tiny coastal village in Cornwall. He didn't have a tailored suit on, and his hair was plastered to his forehead. He laughed, offered her his umbrella, and for 6 months, they existed in a perfect, isolated bubble. He was sweet, attentive, and seemingly unbothered by the fact that Sophia lived in a modest flat in Kensington and worked as an independent historical archivist. But London changes people, especially people whose surnames are stamped on hedge funds and corporate high-rises. When Arthur brought Sophia back to the city to finally meet his family, the bubble didn't just pop. It shattered into jagged little pieces. The Harringtons were wealthy, not the quiet, unassuming wealth of old estates and worn tweed, but the loud, aggressively polished wealth of people who needed you to know exactly how much they were worth. Their primary residence was a sprawling monstrosity in Surrey, filled with imported marble and portraits that looked suspiciously newly painted to resemble ancestors they didn't actually have. At the absolute center of this gilded empire was Brett Harrington, Arthur's mother. Brett was a woman who wielded passive aggression like a finely honed scalpel. From the moment Sophia stepped into her meticulously curated drawing room, wearing a simple but elegant navy dress, she was evaluated, categorized, and dismissed. "Sophia," Brett had said, letting her name roll off her tongue as if she were testing a rather unpleasant vintage of wine. "Arthur tells me you work with old books?" "Historical archives, Mrs. Harrington," Sophia replied politely. "I specialize in restoring and authenticating military correspondence." She offered a thin, aristocratic smile that didn't reach her eyes. "How quaint. And your parents? Do they also dabble in dusty things?" "My parents passed away when I was young," Sophia answered, keeping her voice level. "My father was in the military, a soldier." Chloe, Arthur's younger sister, chimed in from the velvet sofa, examining her manicured nails. "How terribly brave, and terribly common." Sophia looked at Arthur, expecting him to defend her, or at least offer a reassuring glance. Instead, he was suddenly very interested in the rim of his teacup. That was the first red flag, fluttering violently in the wind, which Sophia chose to ignore. She told herself he was just intimidated by his mother. She told herself he would stand up for her when it mattered. She was profoundly, stupidly wrong. Over the next year, the psychological warfare campaign escalated. Brett made it her personal mission to remind Sophia of her place. If they attended a dinner party, Sophia was seated at the far end of the table, usually next to a deaf great-uncle or a business associate they were trying to snub. If she brought a gift, it was handed off to a maid before the wrapping was even acknowledged. Sophia endured it. She endured the sneers, the backhanded compliments, and the deliberate exclusions because she clung to the ghost of the man she had met in Cornwall. But the real torture was watching Arthur slowly morph into an extension of his mother. The sweet, carefree man who had kissed her in the rain was replaced by a rigid social climber who was terrified of losing his trust fund. "Mother just has high standards, Sophia," he would sigh when she confronted him after a particularly brutal Sunday roast. "You have to understand, our family has a reputation to uphold. Just try to blend in a little more. Don't talk about your work so much. People here don't care about old war letters." "They are historical artifacts, Arthur," Sophia had whispered, feeling a familiar, cold steel settling in her chest. "Whatever they are, Just smile and let Mother lead the conversation, he replied, checking his Rolex. He didn't know. He had absolutely no idea who he was talking to. Sophia had built a quiet, unassuming life precisely because the first 26 years of her life had been anything but. She didn't just read military correspondence. She had written it, under deep cover, under fire. But she had promised herself peace, and she thought Arthur was her ticket to a normal, boring, beautiful life. She was willing to swallow a mountain of pride to keep it. The breaking point began to loom with the announcement of the Street Jude's Winter Gala. It wasn't just any gala, it was the zenith of the London social calendar. Hosted at the Grand Dorchester Hotel, it was a charity event, heavily patronized by the aristocracy, military elites, and minor members of the royal family. To be invited was a statement of power. To be seated at a premier table was a coronation. The Harringtons, naturally, had purchased a platinum table months in advance, and Brett, sensing an opportunity for a masterpiece of humiliation, decided it was time to finally break the commoner her son was unfortunately attached to. The preparations for the Street Jude's Gala consumed the Harrington household like a fever. Conversations revolved entirely around who was wearing what, who had been snubbed from the guest list, and which royal was rumored to be making an appearance. A week before the event, a large, garish dress box arrived at Sophia's flat via private courier. Attached was a thick, cream-colored card with Brett's looping handwriting, "Sophia, darling, realizing your archivist's salary might not stretch to the requirements of such a prestigious evening, I took the liberty of selecting something appropriate for you. Do wear it. We wouldn't want you feeling out of place. B." Sophia opened the box, peeling back the layers of tissue paper. She didn't gasp. She just stared. It was a dress, technically speaking, but it was a horrific concoction of neon pink taffeta, excessive ruffles, and cheap, glittering rhinestones that looked like it had been rejected from a low-budget 1980s prom movie. It was monstrous. It was a deliberate, calculated insult. If Sophia wore this to the Dorchester, she would be the laughingstock of London high society. She would look exactly like what Brett claimed she was, a tasteless, desperate imposter trying to play dress-up. Sophia picked up her phone and dialed Arthur. He answered on the third ring, sounding distracted. "Arthur, your mother sent me a dress for the gala," Sophia said, her voice dangerously calm. "Oh, brilliant," he said, the relief palpable in his voice. "She mentioned she was going to help you out. She has wonderful taste, Sophia. Just wear what she sent. It'll make her happy, and it saves us an argument. Arthur, have you seen it?" "I don't need to," he snapped, his tone turning impatient. "Look, I have a massive merger to review. Just play ball, Sophia. For me. Please? I'll pick you up at 7 on Saturday." He hung up. Sophia stood in her tiny living room, looking at the pink monstrosity on her sofa. A younger, more reckless version of herself would have driven to Surrey, set the dress on fire on their manicured lawn, and walked away. But she possessed a terrifying reservoir of patience. She folded the dress neatly, placed it in the bottom of a donation bin down the street, and walked back to her flat. She opened her closet and reached past the modest cardigans and linen skirts to the very back, unzipping a heavy canvas garment bag. Inside was her own gown, a breathtaking, vintage Alexander McQueen in midnight blue silk. It was devoid of sequins or ruffles. Its beauty lay in the razor-sharp tailoring and the way the fabric moved, like liquid shadow. It was the dress she had worn the night the Prime Minister had handed her a small velvet box in a secure, underground bunker. Saturday arrived with a bitter, biting chill. At 6:45 p.m., Sophia received a text from Arthur. "Crisis at the firm. Going straight from the office. Mother is sending a car for you. Meet us in the grand lobby. Don't be late." Sophia sighed, adjusting the silver clasps of her gown, and grabbed her clutch. When she stepped outside, a sleek black town car was waiting. She gave the driver a polite nod and slid into the back. The drive to the Dorchester was tense. The city lights blurred past the rain-streaked windows. As they pulled up to the glittering entrance of the hotel, the driver didn't stop at the red carpet, where the paparazzi and valets were swarming. Instead, he drove around to the side of the building, stopping near a loading dock illuminated by harsh, fluorescent lights. "Excuse me," Sophia said, leaning forward. "This isn't the main entrance." The driver looked at her through the rear-view mirror, his expression apologetic but firm. "I'm sorry, miss. Mrs. Harrington's strict instructions. She provided me with a vendor pass for you, said you were to enter through the service doors and make your way to the lobby from the inside. She said it was easier." The velvet trap had snapped shut. Brett hadn't just tried to dress her like a clown. She was forcing her to enter the premier social event of the season through the kitchens, ensuring that if anyone saw her, she would look like she was trying to crash the party. "I see," Sophia murmured. "Thank you, driver." She stepped out into the freezing rain. She didn't argue with him. He was just a pawn. She walked up to the heavy steel doors of the service entrance. A burly security guard in a high-vis jacket put his hand up. "Hold on there, love. Staff only." "I am a guest of the Street Jude's Gala," Sophia said, her voice cutting through the noise of the rain, holding his gaze with a look that she hadn't used in 3 years. "I was misdirected by my transport. I require entry." He blinked, taken aback by her tone, then looked at her immaculate midnight blue gown. Clearly, she wasn't there to wash dishes. Right. Just down the hall, take the service elevator to the ground floor, then left through the double doors." It took Sophia 10 minutes to navigate the labyrinth of the hotel's back corridors. By the time she pushed through the heavy wooden doors and stepped into the dazzling, chandelier-lit grand lobby of the Dorchester, she was perfectly composed, but a storm was raging in her blood. She scanned the room. The lobby was a sea of tuxedos, glittering diamonds, and expensive champagne. And there, holding court near the center staircase, was the Harrington family. Brett was resplendent in silver sequins, laughing loudly with the Duchess. Arthur stood beside her, looking handsome and entirely oblivious. Sophia took a breath and began to walk toward them. It was time to face the firing squad. The string quartet was playing a soft Mozart piece, but the real soundtrack of the lobby was the clinking of crystal and the hum of strategic networking. As Sophia approached the Harringtons, Chloe was the first to spot her. Her eyes widened, scanning Sophia's midnight blue McQueen gown, realizing instantly that she had defied her mother's sartorial sabotage. She tapped Brett's arm. Brett turned. When she saw Sophia, her polite, aristocratic smile vanished, replaced by a contortion of genuine fury. She hadn't worn the pink monstrosity. She hadn't cowered. She looked, without arrogance, better than anyone in her immediate circle. And to Brett, that was an unforgivable crime. Sophia stopped a few feet from them. "Good evening," she said evenly. Arthur looked relieved for a fraction of a second, then panicked as he saw his mother's face. "Sophia, you made it." "Barely," Brett hissed, though she kept her voice pitched for the immediate circle. "I see you declined my generous gift. How utterly predictable, ungrateful to the core." "The dress didn't fit, Brett," Sophia lied smoothly. "But thank you for the thought, and thank you for the unique drop-off arrangement. The kitchens are lovely this time of year." Brett's eyes flashed. She wasn't used to being challenged, certainly not by Sophia. She took a step forward, and suddenly, her volume increased. It was a calculated move. She wanted an audience. She wanted a spectacle. "I arranged that entrance because it is fitting, Sophia," Brett said loudly, her voice slicing through the nearby conversations. People began to turn their heads. "You do not belong walking the red carpet with families of our stature. Look at you, trying so hard to play dress-up in a gown you likely rented with Arthur's money." "Mother, please," Arthur muttered, his face flushing red. "Not here." "No, Arthur, it needs to be said." Brett projected her voice further. The string quartet seemed to realize a scene was unfolding and played a little softer. A ring of curious, wealthy onlookers began to form around them. "For a year, I have tolerated this. This gold-digging interloper, clinging to your coattails. You bring nothing to this family, Sophia. No name, no wealth, no pedigree. You are a dusty little book clerk who thought she could trap my son. The silence, in their immediate vicinity, was deafening. Even the Duchess Brett had been speaking to stepped back, looking terribly uncomfortable, but unable to look away from the drama. Sophia kept her spine perfectly straight. Her hands were relaxed at her sides. "Brett," she said, her voice low but carrying absolute authority. "You are making a scene. I suggest you lower your voice." "Don't you dare give me orders," Brett shrieked, taking another step forward. In her blind anger, she gestured wildly with her hand, which held a full flute of champagne. The glass tipped, and cold, sticky alcohol splashed directly across the bodice of Sophia's silk gown. A collective gasp echoed from the bystanders. Sophia looked down at the dark stain, ruining the vintage silk. Then she looked up at Brett. The older woman didn't look apologetic. She looked triumphant. "Oh dear," Brett sneered. "Such a shame. You'd better run along to the washroom and clean that up. In fact, why don't you just keep walking right out the door? You've embarrassed us enough for one night." Sophia turned slowly to Arthur. Her heart was a stone. "Arthur, are you going to say anything?" Arthur looked at his shoes. He looked at the crowd of billionaires and lords staring at them. He looked at his mother, whose glare practically dared him to speak. Finally, he looked at Sophia, his eyes full of pathetic, cowardly panic. Just go to the bathroom, Sophia," he whispered harshly. "Clean it up. Don't make this worse than it is. Mother is just stressed." That was it. The final thread snapped. The illusion of Arthur Harrington, the sweet man in the rain, evaporated into nothingness, leaving behind a weak boy terrified of his mother's purse strings. "I see," Sophia said softly. "Go on," Brett barked, waving her hand as if shooing away a stray dog. "Off you go. Leave us to our evening. People of importance are arriving." Suddenly, the heavy brass-studded doors of the grand lobby were pushed open by white-gloved staff. The murmurs in the crowd abruptly halted. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly from gossip to rigid, electric anticipation. A sharp, authoritative voice echoed from the entrance. "Room, attention." Through the doors strode a security detail of staggering magnitude. 6 men, in immaculate, tailored suits, with earpieces moved with terrifying precision, forming a perimeter, but it wasn't the Secret Service that made the crowd freeze. Walking directly behind them was a detachment of the Royal Guard, specifically the Elite Protection Command. They were in full ceremonial dress, their brass polished to a blinding shine, crimson tunics immaculate, medals gleaming under the chandeliers. Leading them was Commander James Sterling, a man whose face was known to every aristocrat in the room. He was the personal military liaison to the crown, a man who answered only to the sovereign. Brett Harrington puffed out her chest, instantly forgetting the scene she had caused. She nudged Arthur. "Look, Arthur, the VIPs are arriving. Stand up straight. They must be clearing the floor for the Duke." The crowd parted like the Red Sea as Commander Sterling and his men marched into the center of the lobby. Their heavy boots struck the marble floor in perfect, intimidating unison. Crack, crack, crack. Brett stepped forward, practically vibrating with the desire to be noticed, pasting on her most sycophantic smile, ready to bow or curtsy to whoever was walking in behind the guard. But Commander Sterling didn't stop at the entrance. He didn't look at the doors. He marched his detachment straight into the center of the room, heading directly toward the Harrington family. Brett's eyes widened with greedy delight. She genuinely thought he was approaching her. She actually began to lower herself into a curtsy. Commander Sterling stopped 2 feet away, but he walked right past Brett. He stopped directly in front of Sophia. The room was so silent, you could hear the champagne fizzing in the glasses. Sophia stood there, her midnight blue dress stained, her posture rigid. Commander Sterling's eyes scanned her face, taking in the stain on her dress, taking in the sneering family standing beside her. His jaw tightened in a micro-expression of absolute lethal fury. Then, he locked eyes with Sophia. He took 1 step back. His heels slammed together, with a noise like a gunshot. His hand shot up in a flawless, razor-sharp salute. Behind him, the The 6 royal guardsmen mirrored his movement instantly, a perfect, unified wall of military reverence. "Ma'am," Commander Sterling barked, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "Captain Sophia Sterling, the perimeter is secure. The Sovereign sends his regards and awaits your presence in the private gallery." Sophia didn't blink. She slowly raised her hand and returned the salute with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent a decade commanding men just like him in places these rich socialites couldn't even point to on a map. "Stand down, Commander," she said quietly. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, dropping his hand, his eyes burning with absolute loyalty. Sophia turned her head. Brett Harrington was frozen in a half-curtsy, her mouth hanging open so wide she looked completely unhinged. The champagne flute she was holding slipped from her fingers and shattered into 100 pieces on the marble floor. Arthur looked like he had just been struck by lightning. They had just publicly executed a penniless archivist. They had no idea they had just declared war on a decorated military hero, a woman who held the Sovereign's absolute trust, and worst of all, Commander James Sterling's fiercely protected younger sister. The sound of Brett's champagne flute shattering on the marble floor was the only noise in the Dorchester's grand lobby. It sounded like a bomb going off. Commander James Sterling did not flinch. His eyes, cold and assessing, finally shifted from Sophia to the spreading puddle of champagne, and then slowly up to Brett's horrified face. The absolute authority radiating from him was palpable. This was a man who briefed the Prime Minister on national security threats before breakfast. He had zero tolerance for the petty cruelties of Mayfair socialites. "Ma'am," James said to Sophia, his voice carrying the crisp, clipped cadence of Sandhurst training, "you appear to have been subjected to an altercation. Shall I have my detail escort these individuals off the premises?" Brett Harrington's face drained of all color. The heavy layer of foundation she wore suddenly looked like a death mask. She opened her mouth, but only a strangled, pathetic squeak came out. The woman who, 3 minutes ago, had commanded the lobby with her viciousness was now trembling violently under the collective stare of 6 royal guardsmen. "Commander Sterling," Arthur stammered, stepping forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. He was sweating right through his bespoke Tom Ford tuxedo. "Please, there's been a massive misunderstanding. This is Sophia, my girlfriend. She's an archivist." James didn't even look at him. He kept his eyes locked on his sister, waiting for his orders. It was the ultimate display of disrespect to Arthur, treating him as though he were nothing more than a mild annoyance, a piece of furniture in the way of a military operation. "She's an archivist," Brett echoed frantically, suddenly finding her voice, though it was an octave higher than usual. "She works with dusty papers in Kensington." She isn't. "She is Captain Sophia Sterling," James finally interrupted, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet volume that somehow commanded more attention than a shout. He slowly turned his head to look directly at Brett, formerly of the Special Reconnaissance Regiment, recipient of the Conspicuous Gallantry Cross, and she is my sister. If you ever raise your voice to her again, Mrs. Harrington, or so much as breathe in her direction, I will personally ensure that the only social event you are ever invited to is a tax audit by HM Revenue and Customs. Do I make myself clear?" The collective gasp from the surrounding crowd was delicious. Billionaires, lords, and shipping magnates literally took a physical step back from the Harrington family. In high society, association is everything. And right now, the Harringtons were radioactive. Arthur looked at Sophia, his eyes wide with a mixture of betrayal and sheer terror. "Sophia, is this true? Why didn't you tell me? Why did you lie to me?" Sophia looked at the man she had spent a year twisting herself into knots for. She looked at his weak chin, his panic-stricken eyes, and the way he instinctively hid slightly behind his mother's sequined shoulder. "I didn't lie, Arthur," Sophia said, her voice steady and completely devoid of the warmth she had once reserved for him. "I told you my father was military. I told you I specialized in restoring military correspondence. I simply omitted that I was restoring the correspondence of the operatives I served alongside in covert theaters. But why, he pleaded, entirely oblivious to the fact that he was cementing his own humiliation in front of London's elite. Why pretend to be a nobody? Because after spending 3 years surviving in war zones, you can't even point to, on a map, I wanted a quiet life, she replied, stepping closer to him. He flinched. I wanted peace. I wanted to see who you were when you thought I had nothing to offer you but myself. I gave you every opportunity to be a decent man, Arthur. I sat at the end of your mother's table. I swallowed her insults. I let you prioritize your trust fund over my dignity. Sophia reached into her clutch and pulled out the small, diamond tennis bracelet he had given her. For their anniversary, a piece of jewelry Brett had loudly pointed out was an entry-level piece. She dropped it onto the marble floor, right next to the shattered champagne glass. You aren't a man, Arthur, she said softly, ensuring only he and his mother heard the final nail going into the coffin. You're just an accessory to your mother's bank account. We are done. She turned her back on them. In the military, turning your back on an enemy is a sign of ultimate contempt. It means they aren't even worth the effort of keeping in your line of sight. Detail, form up, James barked. The 6 guardsmen seamlessly shifted, creating a protective wedge around Sophia. Lead the way, Commander, she said, as they marched toward the private, gold-leafed VIP elevators at the far end of the lobby. Sophia didn't look back, but she didn't need to. The whispers of the crowd were rising into a deafening roar of gossip. The Harrington family was left standing alone in the center of the lobby, surrounded by spilled champagne, shattered glass, and the smoking ruins of their social standing. The doors of the private elevator slid shut, cutting off the chaotic hum of the Dorchester lobby. The polished brass and mirrored interior reflected the stained silk of Sophia's McQueen gown. As soon as the elevator began to ascend, the rigid, terrifying posture of Commander James Sterling vanished. His shoulders dropped, he let out a heavy sigh, and he reached out to pull Sophia into a bone-crushing hug. God, I've missed you, Soph, he murmured into her hair, careful not to crush his metals against her. I missed you too, Jamie, Sophia said, leaning into her older brother's solid frame, letting the adrenaline of the last 20 minutes slowly ebb away. He pulled back, keeping his hands on her shoulders, and inspected the sticky, dark stain on her bodice. He pulled off one of his immaculate white ceremonial gloves and used it to gently dab at the silk, ruining the pristine fabric of the glove in the process. I told you playing civilian was a terrible idea, he scolded gently, tossing the ruined glove into a small brass waste bin in the corner of the elevator. You survived an ambush in Helmand Province, yet you let a Botoxed socialite throw cheap Prosecco on you? It was vintage champagne, actually, Sophia corrected with a tired smile. And I was trying to be normal, James. I just wanted to go to farmers markets and read books. I didn't factor in the Harrington family's aggressive need for dominance. Well, your cover is blown now, Captain, he said, his eyes glinting with a dangerous, fraternal pride. And good riddance. That boy was a wet blanket. The lads in the regiment would have eaten him alive. The elevator chimed, signaling their arrival at the penthouse level. The doors opened to reveal a private corridor lined with heavy mahogany paneling and antique oil paintings. 2 more security personnel stood at the end of the hall, guarding a set of double doors. Are you ready for this? James asked, his professional mask slipping back into place. The Duke of Arlington requested your presence personally. He heard you were back in London. Sophia nodded, adjusting her posture, feeling the familiar, comforting weight of command settle back into her bones. The archivist was dead. Captain Sterling was awake. Let's go. James led the way, nodding to the security detail, who opened the doors to the sovereign's private gallery. The room was breathtaking, a stark contrast to the loud, gaudy wealth of the lobby downstairs. It was an oasis of quiet, generational power. Deep leather armchairs, a roaring fireplace, and a mahogany bar stocked with scotch older than she was. Standing by the fireplace, nursing a crystal tumbler, was Richard, the Duke of Arlington. He was a man in his late 60s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a military bearing that age hadn't managed to soften. He was a senior advisor to the Crown, a veteran of the Falklands, and the man who had personally pinned the conspicuous gallantry cross to Sophia's uniform in a highly classified ceremony 3 years ago. Captain Sterling, the Duke boomed, his face breaking into a wide, genuine smile as he set his glass down. He crossed the room and, completely bypassing protocol, pulled Sophia into a warm embrace. Look at you. Even smelling like a brewery, you're a sight for sore eyes. It's good to see you, Your Grace, she said, returning the smile. None of that Your Grace nonsense in private, Sophia. I thought we agreed on that, he said, gesturing for James and Sophia to take a seat by the fire. He poured 2 more glasses of scotch and handed them to them. I must say, I was briefed on the little skirmish in the lobby just moments ago. My security chief has eyes everywhere. It seems you encountered the Harringtons. Sophia took a sip of the scotch. It burned perfectly all the way down. A minor tactical error on my part, Richard. I thought I could blend in. The Duke chuckled. A dry, raspy sound. Blend in? You? You're a wolf who tried to put on a sheep's fleece, my dear. It was never going to work. He leaned back in his leather chair, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. Though, I must admit, the timing of your public revelation is quite fortuitous. James raised an eyebrow, leaning forward. Fortuitous how, sir? The Duke's eyes narrowed, a shark-like intelligence gleaming in them. Arthur Harrington's firm, Harrington Holdings. They've been aggressively lobbying the Ministry of Defense for the new global logistics and supply chain contract. We're talking billions of pounds, complete oversight of our secure supply lines across Europe and the Middle East. Sophia's blood ran cold. The thought of a coward like Arthur, managed by a venomous snake like Brett, having their hands on the supply lines that kept her former squad mates alive, was sickening. You cannot give them that contract, Richard. They lack the integrity, let alone the security clearance, to handle something that sensitive. They crumble under social pressure. Imagine them under foreign leverage. I am well aware, Sophia, the Duke said smoothly. In fact, the primary reason I am attending this tedious gala tonight was to finalize the final round of vetting for that very contract. Brett Harrington has been leaving me voicemails for a month, trying to secure a private meeting tonight. The Duke stood up and walked over to the heavy velvet curtains, looking down at the glittering street below. The Harringtons' wealth is largely built on a house of cards, heavily reliant on government favor and royal warrants. They believe this Modi contract is their crowning achievement, their ticket to the inner circle of the aristocracy. He turned back to face her, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. I was already hesitant, the Duke continued softly. But hearing that they publicly abused a decorated hero of the crown, that they insulted the sister of the commander of the Royal Guard, well, that is a matter of national security, wouldn't you say, Commander? Absolutely, sir, James replied, his voice practically vibrating with satisfaction, a clear indicator of poor judgment and unstable character. Precisely, the Duke said, returning to his chair. He picked up his phone from the side table and pressed a single button. Charles? Yes, it's Richard. Regarding the Harrington Holdings contract. To pull it. All of it. In fact, initiate a full audit of their current minor government tenders. I want them frozen out of Whitehall by Monday morning. He hung up the phone and looked at Sophia. They wanted to humiliate you to secure their place in high society, Sophia, the Duke said quietly. Instead, they just burned their own empire to the ground. By Monday morning, the financial district of London was a slaughterhouse, and Harrington Holdings was the main course. The Duke of Arlington was not a man who made empty threats. When he pulled a thread, the entire tapestry unraveled. It started quietly at 8 a.m. A terse, encrypted email was sent from Whitehall to Arthur's executive board, notifying them that the Ministry of Defense Logistics contract, the billion-pound lifeline to the firm had bet its entire future on, had been awarded to a rival defense contractor, By 9 a.m., the secondary shockwave hit. Charles, the Duke's ruthless fixer, had initiated the audit. Government auditors descended upon Harrington Holdings with the terrifying, silent efficiency of a tactical strike team. They froze accounts, seized hard drives, and suspended every minor military tender the Harringtons possessed, pending a comprehensive security review. Word travels through the City of London faster than a virus. When the markets opened, Harrington Holdings plummeted. It wasn't just a dip. It was a catastrophic, vertical freefall. Investors, spooked by the sudden and aggressive government freeze, began selling off their shares in a blind panic. Sophia watched it all happen from the secure, oak-paneled study of her brother's townhouse in Belgravia, sipping black coffee. Her phone, which she had kept on purely out of morbid curiosity, had been vibrating non-stop since Sunday afternoon. Arthur had called 42 times. He had left voicemails that ranged from demanding explanations to weeping apologies. She deleted every single one without listening past the first 5 seconds. But the financial ruin was only half the battle. High society, as Brett was about to learn, is a mirror that only reflects you when you are shining. When the light goes out, you disappear. At 1 p.m., Brett Harrington, desperate to do damage control, ordered her driver to take her to the Wellington Club, an ultra-exclusive private members establishment in Mayfair, where she traditionally held court on Mondays. She intended to spin the Dorchester incident as a misunderstanding, to project strength, and to remind the aristocracy of her power. She walked up the marble steps, draped in an immaculate Chanel suit, her chin held high, projecting the desperate illusion of untouchability. She didn't even make it past the front desk. The maitre d', a man who had kissed her cheek just 3 days prior, stepped directly into her path. His face was a mask of polite, impenetrable ice. "I am terribly sorry, Mrs. Harrington," he said smoothly, his voice carrying perfectly to the nearby tables where several duchesses and countesses were suddenly very focused on their Earl Grey tea. "Your membership has been placed under review by the board. I must ask you to leave the premises." Brett froze, her manicured hand gripping her designer handbag so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Excuse me? I am a Platinum founding member. You will step aside this instant, or I will have you fired." The directive came directly from the chairman. "Madame," the maitre d' replied, completely unbothered by her shrill tone, following the unfortunate incident at the street. Jude's Gala. "The board feels your presence no longer aligns with the club's values. Security will escort you to your vehicle." 2 large men in dark suits materialized from the shadows of the lobby. Brett Harrington, the woman who had spent a year telling Sophia she didn't belong, was publicly and unceremoniously marched out of the only world she cared about. She was radioactive. The social guillotine had fallen. By Wednesday, the Harringtons were essentially ghosts in their own city. The invitations to summer regattas, charity balls, and gallery openings were rescinded one by one. Their friends stopped returning their calls. The society pages, which usually fawned over Chloe's wardrobe, ran a scathing blind item about a nouveau riche matriarch who picked a fight with the wrong war hero. Arthur, drowning in the collapse of his firm and the hysterical wrath of his mother, finally snapped. Desperate, he drove to Sophia's modest flat in Kensington, hoping to grovel, to manipulate her into calling off the dogs. He pounded on the door for 10 minutes, shouting her name into the rain. Finally, the elderly landlord opened the ground floor door. "She's gone, mate," the landlord said, eyeing Arthur's rumpled, soaked suit with distaste. "Gone? Where? When is she coming back?" Arthur pleaded, his voice cracking. "Moved out completely on Sunday morning. Military lads came in a big green truck, cleared the whole place out in 20 minutes flat, handed me the keys and told me she'd been reassigned." The landlord paused, a cruel smirk touching his lips. "She left a message, though. Said if a bloke named Arthur came crying around here, I was to tell him that his mother's dress looks lovely in the charity bin down the street." Arthur collapsed onto the wet concrete steps, putting his head in his hands. The sweet, compliant archivist was gone forever. In her place was a ghost who had systematically dismantled his entire life in under 72 hours. The collapse of a dynasty rarely happens overnight, but the Harrington family was a spectacular exception. Over the next 3 weeks, their carefully curated empire of arrogance was dismantled brick by gilded brick. The Ministry of Defense fraud investigation had acted as a massive, fatal, localized earthquake, triggering a tsunami of creditors who suddenly realized the Harringtons' legendary wealth was built entirely on leveraged debt and fragile social capital. The sprawling Surrey estate, the very place where Brett had once relegated Sophia to the corner of the dining room, was seized by the banks. Sophia read about it in the Financial Times over her morning espresso. The article detailed how liquidators had descended upon the property, tagging Brett's imported marble statues and newly painted ancestral portraits with fluorescent auction lot numbers. Rumor had it that Brett had suffered a complete nervous collapse on the front lawn when a repo man towed away her prized Bentley. Chloe, stripped of her platinum credit cards and forced to cancel her Aspen ski trip, had reportedly moved into a cramped flat in Croydon and was actively learning how to navigate the London Underground, a fate her mother considered worse than death. But it was Arthur whose descent was the most pathetic. Stripped of his firm, his trust fund, and his mother's protective umbrella, he was a hollow shell of a man. He had spent his entire life letting his surname open doors. Now, that same surname was a heavy iron padlock. Sophia didn't revel in their destruction, but she didn't pity them either. They were casualties of their own hubris. She had a different life to reclaim. The morning of the Sovereign's annual military review was crisp, cloudless, and biting a perfect, unforgiving London Thursday. It was an event strictly closed to the general public, a breathtaking display of martial power and royal pageantry held at the Horse Guards Parade, reserved entirely for senior military personnel, foreign dignitaries, and the highest echelon of the crown. Sophia stood in front of the full-length mirror in the antechamber of the Whitehall Command Center. She was no longer wearing vintage silk, and she was no longer attempting to soften her edges to make a weak man feel comfortable. She was in full No-1 dress uniform. The dark navy fabric was impeccably tailored, sharply contrasting with the gleaming brass buttons. On her left breast sat 3 rows of ribbons, culminating in the heavy, silver cross of the conspicuous gallantry medal. She pulled on her crisp white gloves, feeling the familiar, grounding weight of the fabric. Commander James Sterling stepped into the room, looking immaculate in his crimson tunic and towering bearskin cap. He stopped, his sharp eyes taking in her reflection in the mirror. He offered a rare, genuine smile that didn't quite reach the stern lines of his jaw. "Look at you, Captain," he murmured, his voice thick with a fierce, protective pride. "Right back where you belong." "It feels heavier than I remember," Sophia replied, tracing the edge of her medals with a gloved fingertip. "But it fits." "It always did, Sophia. You just had to stop pretending you were made of glass." James checked his gold pocket watch. "The bugles will sound in 5 minutes. The Sovereign's carriage is approaching them all. Are you ready?" "Lead the way, Commander," she said. They marched out into the blinding sunlight of the parade ground. The sheer scale of the event was awe-inspiring, a visceral reminder of the power she had once commanded and the institution she served. Thousands of troops stood in perfect, unmoving formation on the gravel. The cavalry horses tossed their plumed heads, their breath pluming in the cold air, and the massed military bands played with earth-shaking, terrifying precision. Sophia took her place in the VIP viewing gallery, standing shoulder to shoulder with 4-star generals, admirals, and defense ministers. The Duke of Arlington stood a few feet away. When he caught her eye, he gave a slow, deep nod of absolute respect. The high society aristocrats, who had been at the St. Jude's Gala, were also in attendance, seated in the stands behind them. She could feel their eyes burning into the back of her uniform. They whispered behind their velvet-gloved hands, terrified and captivated by the woman they had allowed Brett Harrington to mock. For 2 hours, The parade washed over her in a wave of brass, thundering hooves, and shouted commands. It was a baptism, washing away the last lingering remnants of the quiet, submissive archivist she had tried to be. As the ceremony concluded, and the crowds of dignitaries began to filter out toward the secure exit gates on Whitehall, the atmosphere loosened. Sophia walked down the stone steps, flanked by two towering Royal Marine commandos assigned as her temporary detail. And then she saw him. Arthur Harrington was standing on the civilian side of the towering wrought iron gates, pressed against the black metal bars like a desperate prisoner of war. The contrast between them was absolute. While she was surrounded by the elite power of the British military, he looked like a vagrant. He was wearing the exact same bespoke Tom Ford tuxedo he had worn to the gala 3 weeks ago, but it was ruined. It was stained, wrinkled, and hung loosely on his shrinking frame. His face was pale, unshaven, and ravaged by exhaustion. He had clearly bribed or begged a low-level security guard just to get close to the perimeter. He saw her walking toward the exit. His bloodshot eyes widened, taking in the uniform, the medals, the two heavily armed Marines at her side, and the absolute deference the passing officers showed her. "Sophia!" he screamed. His voice was raw, grating against the iron bars as he clawed at them. "Sophia! Please! Over here! Just 5 minutes!" Sophia stopped. The two commandos, flanking her, immediately stepped forward, hands resting instinctively on their sidearms, their eyes locking onto Arthur as a potential threat. "Hold," she commanded softly, raising a single, white-gloved hand. The Marines froze instantly, returning to a state of relaxed readiness. She turned and walked slowly toward the heavy iron gates. With every step she took, Arthur's eyes lit up with a pathetic, desperate hope. He actually thought the girl he had met in the rain in Cornwall was coming back to save him. He thought his tears would melt the obsidian she had forged over a lifetime of survival. She stopped 2 feet from the gate, the cold iron bars separating her world from his. He was shaking violently, though whether from the cold or from the adrenaline of his own ruin, she couldn't tell. "Sophia," he sobbed, pressing his face against the metal. "Please, they're taking everything. The banks took the estate this morning. My mother is in a psychiatric clinic. The firm is completely bankrupt. I have nowhere to go. Please, I love you. I know you still love me. Remember Cornwall? Remember the rain?" Sophia looked at him. She didn't feel anger. She didn't feel vindication. She felt an overwhelming, profound emptiness. "I remember Cornwall, Arthur," she said, her voice perfectly calm, carrying Cully over the ambient noise of the dispersing crowd. It was the voice of a commander, delivering a final, clinical situation report. "I was happy there, but you were just on vacation from your mother's expectations. As soon as we returned to London, you went right back to being her lapdog. I was a fool," he pleaded, shoving his hand through the bars, desperate to touch the sleeve of her uniform. "I was a coward. I know that now. I should have stood up to Brett. I should have protected you from her. Just talk to the Duke. Tell him to call off the auditors. You have the power to fix this. We can start over." She looked at his outstretched, trembling hand. She didn't move an inch. "You didn't ruin your life because you failed to protect me, Arthur," she stated coldly, locking her eyes onto his terrified gaze. "You ruined your life because you fundamentally misunderstood who needed protecting." His hand slowly dropped. The realization finally hit him, settling into his bones with the suffocating weight of wet concrete. She wasn't a victim he had failed to save. She was the predator he had foolishly invited into his house and tried to cage. Your family valued power over character, wealth over loyalty. You wanted a prop to sit at the end of your table, to absorb your mother's venom and make you feel like a man, she continued, her tone dropping to a lethal whisper. But you chose a soldier. And soldiers do not absorb fire, Arthur. We return it. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a broken, breathless sob escaped. He slumped against the bars, sliding down to his knees on the cold London pavement. Sophia took a step back, breaking eye contact, severing the final, invisible thread that tied her to the Harrington family. "Detail," she commanded sharply. The two Royal Marines snapped to attention, their boots cracking against the stone. "Ma'am, clear this civilian from the perimeter. He is obstructing the exit." "Yes, ma'am." Sophia turned her back on Arthur Harrington for the final time and walked away into the sunlit courtyard, the heavy brass gates locking shut behind her with a resounding, final clang. She heard the rough, uncompromising voices of the Marines ordering him to move, followed by his broken, defeated weeping fading into the ambient noise of the city. The ghost of the girl in the rain was finally laid to rest. Captain Sophia Sterling walked forward, entirely unbroken, stepping back into the light where she belonged. What an absolutely legendary display of karma. Sophia's journey from a quiet, underestimated outsider to a terrifying force of absolute authority proves that true power never has to shout. It simply waits for the right moment to strike. Brett and Arthur learned the hardest lesson of all. When you humiliate someone for their lack of status, you might just be digging your own social grave. If you felt that rush of adrenaline when Commander Sterling threw that salute, and if you loved seeing a toxic, arrogant family get exactly the justice they deserved, hit that like button right now. Don't forget to share this story with anyone who needs a reminder that the quietest people in the room are often the most dangerous. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss out on more epic, satisfying stories of revenge, drama, and ultimate redemption.